the DSM, how we diagnose all mental health conditions. What all shrinks read before going to bed. It's the book that lists out the criteria for all mental health conditions. But is it really that accurate? Actually capture the full spectrum of human suffering? Today, we're diving into one of the most fundamental and often nuanced and misunderstood topics within psychiatry, how we define and diagnose mental health conditions. So let's get started. Hey friends, welcome back to Shrink Talk with Dr. Robert, hosted by me, Dr. Robert, a board-certified psychiatrist. And on this channel, I talk about all things mental health. In today's video, I'll be discussing one of the most controversial, nuanced, and quite frankly fascinating concepts in all of mental health. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Fun fact, before the DSM, there was no mental illness. Simpler times. Just kidding, of course. Before the DSM, of course, there was mental illness. We just had no consistent way of diagnosing it, classifying, or even, quite frankly, thinking about it. Basically, different doctors would have their own way of classifying what was a mental illness and also how to treat it. And of course, this contributed to some controversial treatments. This included restraints, ice baths, injections with insulin, and yes, of course, frontal lobotomies. We're still working on our PR from that. But as the rest of medicine began demanding more evidence-based practices, psychiatry realized that they also had to step it up. And so, the first DSM was published in 1952, which in the history of medicine isn't all that long ago. Of course, it was far from perfect, but it was at least a start. And since then, the DSM has gone through multiple revisions, the latest version being the DSM-5-TR. So, what did this bulky, acronym-filled text do for us? Well, it actually did a lot of good things. It standardized how we diagnose mental health conditions, so no more weird guessing games. It allowed researchers to study mental health in a more consistent and systematic way. Of course, insurance companies now had a diagnosis that they could bill for, so you could get your treatment paid for. But it also gave legitimacy to the field of psychiatry, and that in and of itself was very useful. And despite its many flaws that I'll get into, it definitely allows mental health practitioners to communicate in a very effective and standardized way. And having these standardized diagnoses also better allows us to create treatment plans for them. Because like anything powerful with large implications, the DSM has its many flaws, and here is the main one. The diagnoses are largely based off of subjective symptoms and objective observations of behavior. And symptoms are often things like low mood or racing thoughts, which can be experienced differently by different people. They're hard to measure, categorize, and even agree upon. Then we have behavior, which is a little bit more observable, so slightly more objective, but no less complex. The same behavior can be caused by trauma, genetics, poor sleep, or just too many shots of espresso. And unlike other fields of medicine, we don't have genetic tests or blood tests or brain scans or any other sort of objective testing that can tell us what's going on, at least not reliably. We're working with patterns and clusters of behavior and symptoms, not biological certainty. To better illustrate this, let's go through an analogy. So let's say we're trying to diagnose what's wrong with the car, but there's a catch. You can't open the hood, there are no dashboard lights to tell you what's going on, and the owner of the car can only tell you how it feels or sounds like when they drive the car. That's it. Now, imagine trying to build an entire diagnostic manual based off of just that. You're kind of able to group things into sad engine syndrome, anxious brake disorder, major radiator spectrum disorder. That's basically what the DSM is trying to do. Create a classification system based off of subjective experiences and observations, even when the underlying mechanisms aren't fully understood. It's messy, it's imperfect, but still better than guessing. And this creates a lot of gray area. And that's also one of the very interesting things about this profession and why this field never gets boring to practice. When you think of disorder or disease, you might think of something like virus, bacteria, a faulty gene, or a type of cancer cell, or a broken bone, or something of that nature. But that's not how mental health works. Instead, think of hundreds, if not thousands, of overlapping factors. Things like genetics, upbringing, stress, diet, and many, many other factors that all contribute to how someone experiences a mental illness.
So I thought using an example to better illustrate this point would be useful here. So let's take, for example, generalized anxiety disorder. It's basically a diagnosis in the DSM that requires recurrent worry to various different aspects of life that can cause muscle tension, issues with sleep, and that has to be present for at least 6 months or longer. And as you can probably imagine, many people can fit these diagnostic criteria at some point in their lives. But if they do fit them, does that mean everybody who experiences generalized anxiety disorder has the same disorder? I mean, they get the same diagnosis, so wouldn't it make sense that they have the same brain condition, life experience? Certainly not necessarily, and most psychiatrists would view generalized anxiety disorder as a very sort of vague descriptive term and classification of symptoms that is very useful to think about as a group, as a single diagnosis, but in reality is probably caused by many different things and can take place in different parts of the brain and be caused by different mental health processes, neurologic conditions, life experiences, life traumas, genetic vulnerabilities, and many other causes. So one person's generalized anxiety may be largely genetic and also influenced by their home environment, or another person's generalized anxiety may be caused largely by certain environmental stressors like a really tough workplace, an unstable relationship, financial stress. And for different people, this may involve overactivity or underactivity in very different parts of the brain. That's also why certain treatments may work for one person, not another. One type of therapy may work for this person, and yet not greatly for this person. Or a medication may work for this person and not another individual. And so it becomes very individualized. So the diagnosis is still useful because it tells us, hey, this person is experiencing anxiety, these symptoms, so we can classify it and sort of steer them towards certain treatments that are shown to be effective for it. But it won't always necessarily mean that two people with the same diagnosis experience the same exact thing, or that the same thing will be useful in treating them. Hope that sort of illustrates that point. Of course, that doesn't make mental health conditions any less real. It just makes them a lot more complicated. And I think we as humans do have this tendency that the more complicated and nuanced something becomes, the harder it is for us to understand and be able to fully acknowledge. That's very much true outside of medicine, right? Even concepts around politics, world events, other issues, religion, right? All of these things that become much more granular, become harder for us to grasp. And the more black and white they are, the easier it is for us to understand them. And that can lead to a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions about various topics, not just mental health. I hope that sort of clarifies it. That's also why I'm such an advocate for not black and white thinking, but seeing everything with nuance as being on a gray scale. Having many factors contributing to it, because that allows us to better appreciate what the reality of life is. And that is, it's not straightforward, it's not simple, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio for the most part. It's not a math equation.
That's why I, like many other psychiatrists and mental health providers, view mental illness as existing on this spectrum of being very multifactorial, with many components and parts of life contributing to it, and very many different ways of addressing it as well. There are ranges, subtypes, and much overlap between different diagnoses. No sharp lines ever. And after all, everyone feels anxiety, stress, depression, lack of focus. What technically turns it into a diagnosis is its intensity, its ability to disrupt our day-to-day life. And that takes a much more nuanced and comprehensive approach than the DSM can provide us with. Here's the thing, the people that even write the DSM, they're very aware of its limitations and its flaws. I mean, after all, trying to categorize the full scope of human suffering is a pretty tall task, one we may actually never fully achieve. And I think that that's actually okay. It's not about getting things fully understood, fully explained and categorized, but being able to have a good enough framework to work with and fully appreciating the limitations of that framework. I don't think the goal should be to have this completely perfect way of categorizing mental health symptoms and explaining them away, but rather having a good enough tool that can at least guide our approach, guide our understanding, and being self-aware enough to know the limitations of that tool. And of course, what goes into the DSM also involves a lot of public opinion, politics, and of course, heated academic debate. So yes, the DSM is helpful, but it's not gospel. Here are my parting thoughts on this topic. Some psychiatrists love the DSM, others hate it. I just see it as a tool, a roadmap, something that helps guide my understanding, classify things, guide treatment, but I take it with a grain of salt. I understand it's not the end-all be-all. It doesn't fully capture people's experiences. After all, I never treat a diagnosis, I treat people. All right, friends, thanks so much for hanging tight for today's deep dive into our diagnostic manual. There's so much more we can explore on this topic and many nuances and other things to get into. So definitely like and subscribe, hit that notification button, and you guys will be kept up to date on my takes on these very nuanced, very difficult topics. And of course, leave comments down below, either on your thoughts about the DSM, our current flaws and positives of how we diagnose mental health. If you have any suggestions of what you want to hear about next, definitely leave that as well. All right, my friends, my parting words for today are, never forget that nothing is ever black or white, and there's much nuance, and a diagnosis never defines you. Take care until next week.